The night was still, with only the soft hum of the desert winds blowing over the jagged rocks and dry, cracked earth. Blake Harrison sat in a folding chair outside his cabin, staring up at the vastness of the cosmos. His telescope lay untouched beside him, for tonight wasn't about data collection or chasing faint glimmers of distant galaxies. It was a night for him to unwind, to feel insignificant under the blanket of stars, a rare respite from the pressures of his work as a reclusive scientist. Blake's cabin, isolated deep in the Utah desert, was miles from the nearest town. It was his sanctuary from the world, a place where he could focus on his atmospheric research and avoid the complexities of human interaction. Here, he was alone just the way he liked it. But tonight, something changed. It started as a flicker, a glint in the sky that caught his attention. At first, he thought it was a meteor. But it moved too deliberately, its path too precise for something so random. Blake squinted, his curiosity piqued. The object grew larger as it descended, trailing a long tail of fire, but what was most striking was its speed. It wasn't falling, it was crashing. Before he could fully comprehend what was happening, a loud, earth-shaking boom echoed through the desert. The ground trembled beneath his feet, and Blake instinctively jumped up, his heart pounding. He grabbed his flashlight, adrenaline coursing through his veins. A part of him screamed to stay back, to avoid the unknown. But another part, his scientist's curiosity, pushed him forward. Blake sprinted across the uneven desert terrain, his flashlight beam bouncing wildly in front of him. The night air was cold, but he barely felt it through his thin jacket. As he got closer to the impact site, he could see smoke rising into the air, illuminated by the glow of something metallic embedded in the earth. His breath hitched when he reached the edge of the crater. There, nestled in the smoldering soil, was the wreckage of a spacecraft. It was sleek, silver, and otherworldly, nothing like the clunky machines Earth had sent into space. Its surface was smooth and reflective, but now marred by jagged tears and scorch marks. Steam hissed from the cracks, and strange, alien symbols glowed faintly along its hull. Blake's heart raced. This was no meteor. This was a craft, a vessel from somewhere far beyond Earth. His mind buzzed with questions, but before he could take another step, movement in the wreckage caught his eye. Something was inside. A figure, humanoid in shape, staggered from the twisted remains of the ship. Blake's breath caught in his throat as he watched. It was a woman, at least, she looked like one. She was tall, her limbs graceful even in her weakened state, and her skin shimmered with a soft, almost ethereal glow. Her long, silver hair floated as if touched by a gentle breeze, even though the air was still. Blake stood frozen, flashlight aimed at her. His mind told him to run, to get far away from whatever was unfolding before him, but his body refused to move. He was witnessing something that defied everything he knew about the universe. The alien woman stumbled forward, her body collapsing to her knees in the soft sand. Blake instinctively rushed toward her, adrenaline overriding any fear. Up close, she was even more striking. Her features were delicate, almost too perfect, and her violet eyes, wide with pain, met his with an intensity that made him stop in his tracks. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible, but melodic in a way that sent shivers down his spine. Blake blinked. You're hurt. You need help." Her breathing was labored, and her glowing skin had dimmed, almost as if she were fading. Despite the language barrier, her desperation was clear. She tried to speak again, but the words were foreign, a soft and strange language that Blake had never heard before. Her voice faltered, and she slumped forward, her strength leaving her. Blake quickly knelt beside her, unsure of what to do. Her skin felt cool to the touch, and her body was trembling. He had no idea how to help an alien, but he couldn't just leave her here to die. As he fumbled with her, his eyes caught sight of a small device on her wrist, a bracelet, or maybe some sort of advanced technology. Suddenly, the device pulsed with light, and Blake felt a wave of energy ripple through the air. The sensation made his hair stand on end. Before he could react, the alien's voice changed, her words shifting mid-sentence until they became clear and understandable. "Please," she gasped. "I beg you. Take me as your servant." Blake's mind went blank. Servant? The word echoed in his head as he stared at the alien woman in disbelief. He had expected many things when he saw her, but that was not one of them. What are you talking about?" Blake stammered, still trying to process what he was seeing and hearing. "You don't need to be a servant." I dash. Her eyes, those deep, violet pools, locked onto his, pleading. "I have nowhere else to go," she whispered, her voice trembling. "My ship is destroyed. My people will hunt me. I am in exile. Please, I offer myself to you. I can serve. I will do anything you ask." Blake stared at her, his mind reeling. She was in exile? Hunted by her own people? And now she was asking him, a complete stranger, an Earthling, to take her in, to keep her safe. "Wait," Blake said, shaking his head. "Slow down. You don't have to be a servant. I just dash." Her hand weakly grasped his arm, her grip surprisingly strong despite her weakened state. "Please," she said again, her eyes filled with fear and desperation. "I beg of you. Let me stay. Let me serve you." Blake swallowed, his heart pounding in his chest. This was too much, too fast. But looking into her eyes, he couldn't find the words to refuse her. How could he? "Okay," he said softly. "Okay, I'll help you. But we'll figure this out together." The alien woman's body relaxed slightly, and for the first time, Blake saw a flicker of relief cross her face. "Thank you," she whispered, before her eyes fluttered shut and her body went limp, exhaustion finally overtaking her. Blake crouched beside her, his mind still spinning. What had he just gotten himself into? An alien had crash-landed on Earth, asked him to take her as a servant, and now she was unconscious in his arms. The world as he knew it had just changed forever. As he gently lifted her, carrying her back to his cabin, Blake couldn't help but wonder, who was this alien beauty? And what kind of danger had she brought with her? The night sky above him was still, but Blake knew his life would never be the same again. Blake's cabin was a simple, utilitarian structure, built for solitude and research, not for housing extraterrestrial refugees. The harsh fluorescent lights inside flickered on as Blake carried the alien woman Lyria, as she had introduced herself across the threshold and laid her gently on the worn leather couch in his small living room. His heart was still racing. The enormity of what had just happened hadn't fully sunk in. He stood there for a moment, staring at her, his mind swirling with questions. Her shimmering, iridescent skin seemed to glow faintly in the dim light of the cabin, and despite the grime and damage from her crash, she still looked otherworldly beautiful, yes, but alien in ways that unsettled him. Blake ran a hand through his messy brown hair and let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. What now? He wasn't a doctor, let alone a doctor familiar with alien biology, but Lyria needed help. He grabbed a towel from the bathroom and dampened it with cool water before kneeling next to her. As he wiped the grime and dirt from her face and arms, he noticed how delicate her features were up close. Her skin felt smooth and cool to the touch, almost too smooth, like polished stone, yet there was a warmth to it that suggested life just different from anything he knew. As he worked, Blake's mind kept returning to her words. "My people will hunt me. Exiled. Fugitive. Hunted." What had she done? Who were her people? His imagination filled the gaps with wild, impossible scenarios: interstellar wars, alien politics, ancient civilizations. But this was real. She was real, lying here in his cabin, her fate now tangled with his. A soft groan escaped Lyria's lips, pulling Blake from his thoughts. Her eyes fluttered open, those deep violet irises shimmering faintly in the low light. For a moment, she looked confused, disoriented, and then her gaze found his. The desperation from earlier was still there, but now it was tempered with something else awareness. You saved me, Lyria murmured, her voice soft but clearer now, less strained. Blake nodded, his voice thick with the confusion he still felt. I guess so. You were in pretty bad shape when I found you. Lyria sat up slowly, wincing as she moved. Blake could see the exhaustion etched into her face, though her injuries seemed to be healing faster than he expected. Perhaps her physiology was far more advanced than human biology. Where am I? She asked, glancing around the small cabin with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. You're in my cabin. In the middle of nowhere, Utah, Blake explained. It's quiet out here. No one comes around much. Seemed like a good place to lay low until you're feeling better. Lyria nodded, but there was a sadness in her eyes as she took in her surroundings, a kind of resignation. It is enough, she said softly, her gaze distant for a moment. Then she turned back to him, her expression more focused. Thank you, Earthling. Blake chuckled nervously at the formal tone. Blake, he corrected, offering a tentative smile. You can call me Blake. Blake, she repeated, the name sounding strange on her tongue. I am Lyria of Xylora. And now, I am yours. For as long as you allow me to stay. That last part still made Blake uneasy. Servant? Hers? He didn't want anyone, let alone an alien fugitive, pledging themselves to him. He wasn't even sure what he had agreed to. This wasn't some ancient sci-fi story where aliens and humans established master-servant bonds. Was it? Look, you don't have to, Blake started, but Lyria cut him off with a gentle but firm shake of her head. You do not understand, she said, her voice laced with quiet urgency. I am exiled. Hunted. There are forces in this galaxy that will stop at nothing to find me, to destroy me. I cannot offer you wealth or power, but I can offer you my service. In exchange, I asked for sanctuary. Blake frowned, still not fully grasping the gravity of her situation. Exiled from your home? But why? What happened? Lyria hesitated, her eyes lowering to the floor. A long silence followed, during which Blake could see the internal struggle she was grappling with. When she finally spoke, her voice was tinged with regret. My people, the Xylorians. We are a proud and ancient race, she began, her gaze still distant. We have expanded across the galaxy for millennia, claiming new worlds, advancing through conquest. I was born into a ruling house, destined to be a leader among my kind. Blake listened intently, his mind racing with the implications of her words. An empire of conquerors. The idea both fascinated and terrified him. I was to lead the next conquest, Lyria continued, her voice growing softer. The next target was Earth. Blake's blood ran cold. Earth? You mean? Your people were planning to invade Earth? She nodded, a deep sorrow in her eyes. Yes. It has been our way for centuries. Your planet was seen as weak, primitive, easy to conquer, rich in resources. I was to lead the invasion fleet. For a moment, Blake couldn't speak. He felt a surge of disbelief, then anger. But you didn't. You crashed. Why? Lyria's gaze finally met his, and the weight of her next words hung heavily between them. I refused. Blake blinked, confused. Refused? I saw your world, she said, her voice trembling slightly. I studied your people. And I saw something my people had forgotten, something they had lost long ago. Potential. Life. Beauty and diversity. Where they saw weakness, I saw hope. Her eyes shone with conviction, but also with deep regret. I could not bring myself to destroy it. So I refused. I defied my orders. For that, I was branded a traitor, stripped of my title, my rank, everything. I became a fugitive. My people have sent hunters across the galaxy to find me, to silence me. Blake felt like the ground had been pulled out from under him. Not only was she a fugitive, but she had once been part of an alien race that had Earth in its sights for conquest. And yet, here she was, sitting in his cabin, telling him she had chosen to defy her people to save his world. "So, you're hiding," Blake said slowly, trying to piece it all together. "From them? From your own people?" Lyria nodded. "Yes. But they will not stop. They will come for me and for Earth." Blake's heart pounded in his chest. "And how long do we have before they come?" Lyria shook her head, her expression grim. "It is hard to say. The fleet will arrive soon, but the hunters will be here first. They know I'm on Earth, and they will not stop until they find me." Blake took a deep breath, trying to process everything she was telling him. Aliens were coming to invade Earth, and Lyria was the only one who stood in their way. And now, by helping her, he had put himself in the crosshairs. "I can't believe this," Blake muttered, rubbing his face. "This is insane." Lyria's gaze softened. "I know this is much to ask of you, Blake. But I had nowhere else to turn. You were the first to show me kindness." Blake looked at her, the weight of her words sinking in. He didn't fully understand her culture, her people, or the magnitude of what she had risked. But he could see the truth in her eyes. She was alone. Desperate. And despite everything, she had chosen to protect his world, even if it meant sacrificing her own life. He sat down on the floor across from her, his mind still racing, but his resolve slowly hardening. "So, what do we do? How do we stop them?" Lyria took a deep breath, her violet eyes locking onto his. "We prepare. We fight. And we stop the invasion before it begins." Blake nodded, determination slowly settling into his chest. He didn't know what he had gotten himself into, but one thing was clear: he couldn't turn back now. The fate of the planet and perhaps the galaxy had just fallen into his hands. The small cabin, once Blake's sanctuary of quiet solitude, had become a war room. The table in the center of the room was now covered in a chaotic mix of Lyria's alien technology and Blake's Earth-made tools, an odd fusion of two worlds. Blake sat at one end, poring over sketches and crude maps of the solar system, while Lyria stood across from him, her violet eyes scanning a holographic projection of her home planet, Xylora, and its nearby moons. Blake's mind was still spinning from the revelations of the last few days. Aliens were coming, no, they were already on their way. And Earth had no idea. He had always imagined there was life out there in the universe, but he had never thought it would arrive in the form of a galactic empire hellbent on conquest. And now, sitting at his kitchen table, he was planning how to stop an invasion. "So," Blake said, rubbing his temples, "this gateway is the key to all of this?" Lyria nodded, her gaze fixed on the projection, which showed a massive, swirling vortex stationed on the surface of one of Xylora's moons. "Yes. The gateway is how my people travel quickly across vast distances. It's a technology we perfected long ago, allowing our ships to bypass the slow travel of light speed and arrive at distant systems almost instantaneously." Blake studied the hologram, trying to wrap his head around the scale of it. "And if we destroy it?" "We sever their ability to reach Earth," Lyria replied, her voice steady but grim. "Without the gateway, their invasion fleet will be stranded. The journey to Earth would take decades, even centuries, without it." Blake leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. Destroy the gateway, and the invasion would be stopped before it even began. It sounded simple enough, but there was one massive complication. The gateway was located on a moon of Xylora, her home planet, deep in enemy territory. Getting there, let alone sabotaging it, seemed like an impossible task. "Okay," Blake said slowly, "but how do we get to Xylora? You said your ship was destroyed in the crash. Even if we had a way to travel, we'd be walking right into the heart of your enemy's empire. How do we avoid getting caught?" Lyria tapped the control panel on her wrist, and the hologram shifted, zooming in on Xylora's moon. Her expression was tense as she spoke. I still have access to certain resources, hidden channels within the Empire. My people may have exiled me, but there are sympathizers, those who believe in what I did. I can get us a ship, one capable of cloaking our presence, but once we're on the moon, we'll be on our own. It's heavily fortified, protected by Xylorian military forces. Blake's stomach dropped. So we're sneaking into a military base on an alien moon to blow up a gateway that's the only thing stopping an invasion of Earth? He shook his head, a wry smile tugging at his lips despite the gravity of the situation. This is insane. Lyria didn't smile. Her face remained solemn, her eyes full of determination. It is our only chance. Blake looked at her, the weight of their task settling heavily on his shoulders. She was right. The invasion was coming, and Earth didn't stand a chance if the Xylorian fleet arrived. He couldn't let that happen. Okay, he said, sitting up straighter. We're doing this. What's the plan? Lyria gave him a small, grateful nod before tapping her wrist device again. A detailed blueprint of the gateway facility appeared, showing a sprawling complex of metallic structures nestled into the rocky landscape of the moon. We'll infiltrate the facility through an underground service route here. She pointed to a narrow passage on the hologram. It's an older part of the structure, rarely patrolled, but it will get us close to the gateway's core. Blake squinted at the blueprint. And once we're inside? I'll handle the sabotage, Lyria said. The gateway's core is powered by an energy source we call the Xylox crystal. If we destabilize it, the entire structure will collapse. But the crystal is highly volatile. We will have minutes, maybe less, before the whole facility goes down. Blake swallowed hard. So, we'll be blowing up the gateway and trying to escape a collapsing alien base at the same time? Yes, Lyria said simply, her voice unwavering. Blake rubbed the back of his neck, the enormity of the mission sinking in. It was a suicide run, no doubt about it. But there was no other way. If they didn't stop the Xylorians, Earth would fall. Billions of lives were at stake, and they were the only ones who could stop it. All right, Blake said, determination settling into his voice. When do we leave? Lyria glanced at the window, where the early morning light was just beginning to break over the desert horizon. We leave tonight. The hunters will arrive soon, and we need to be gone before they find us. I'll make contact with one of my sympathizers and secure us a ship. Blake nodded, standing up and stretching. I'll gather what supplies we can bring. I'm guessing there's not much we can take with us. Only what we can carry, Lyria confirmed. We'll need to travel light and fast. As Blake moved through the cabin, gathering what little gear he thought might be useful, he couldn't help but feel the weight of what they were about to do. This wasn't just about survival anymore, it was about saving the planet, about stopping an empire that had already taken so much from Lyria. He had never imagined he'd be thrust into the middle of something so colossal, but now, there was no turning back. By the time night fell, the cabin was dark, save for the faint glow of the stars overhead. Blake stood outside, staring up at the sky, knowing that somewhere out there, the Xylorian fleet was making its way toward Earth. He wondered how long it would take the governments of the world to realize what was coming, if they ever would. He imagined how chaotic it would be if news of an impending alien invasion spread. Panic. Fear. Confusion. But no one knew. Except him. And Lyria. A soft hum broke the silence of the night, and Blake turned to see Lyria approaching from the shadows, her wrist device flashing as she manipulated it. Beside her, a sleek, triangular-shaped ship materialized, its edges shimmering as its cloaking technology deactivated. The ship was small, designed for stealth, but it looked fast-blazing with alien energy. The ship is ready, Lyria said, her voice soft but determined. We must go now. The hunters will be here soon. Blake took a deep breath, his heart pounding. This was it. The moment of truth. He glanced back at the cabin one last time, knowing that he might never see it again, then nodded to Lyria. Let's do this. They boarded the ship, and within moments, it lifted silently off the ground, disappearing into the night sky. Blake watched as the earth grew smaller below them, the vast expanse of space stretching out before them. For a brief moment, as the stars swirled outside the cockpit, he allowed himself to marvel at the view. He had always dreamed of seeing the stars up close, of traveling beyond the bounds of Earth. Now he was doing it, though not under the circumstances he had ever imagined. As they approached Xylora's moon, the tension in the ship grew palpable. Blake could see the massive structures of the Xylorian military base coming into view, its defenses lighting up on the radar. "We're approaching the facility," Lyria said, her voice steady. "Once we're inside, there's no turning back." Blake's heart raced, but he pushed the fear down, focusing on the mission ahead. "No turning back," he echoed. The ship slipped through the moon's atmosphere, undetected by the base's sensors, and landed silently in the shadows of a rocky outcrop near the underground entrance Lyria had mentioned. Blake took one last deep breath, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped his pack. "Let's go save the world," he said, more to himself than anyone else. Lyria's gaze met his, and for the first time since they'd met, a small, almost imperceptible smile tugged at the corner of her lips. "Yes," she said softly. "Let's." And with that, they stepped out into the hostile alien terrain, ready to face whatever awaited them. The air on Xylora's moon was thin and sharp, biting at Blake's skin as he and Lyria crept through the shadowed canyon toward the entrance of the underground facility. Above them, the sky was a strange, swirling mass of dark purples and blues, speckled with alien stars, but there was no time to appreciate the surreal beauty of the landscape. The moon's surface was barren and hostile, just like the facility they were about to infiltrate. Blake's heart raced in his chest as they approached the entrance, a small, nondescript hatch nestled into the rock face. It was exactly where Lyria's hologram had shown it to be. The entrance was an old service route, long abandoned by regular patrols. Or so they hoped. Blake knelt by the entrance, his fingers trembling slightly as he worked to override the locking mechanism with a small, Xylorian device that Lyria had given him. The seconds dragged on, and every tiny beep from the device sounded impossibly loud in the stillness of the alien night. Finally, with a soft hiss, the hatch slid open. "We're in," Blake whispered, his voice barely audible. Lyria gave him a curt nod, her violet eyes sharp and focused. "Stay close. We don't have much time." They slipped inside, the heavy metal door closing behind them with a faint click. The interior was cold and sterile, the walls made of gleaming metallic panels that hummed with a soft energy Blake couldn't quite place. The passageway was dimly lit, casting long, eerie shadows as they moved through it. "How far to the core?" Blake asked in a hushed tone, his eyes darting around, half expecting an alarm to sound at any moment. "Not far," Lyria replied, her voice equally quiet but steady. "We'll follow this corridor until we reach the central chamber. The core is there along with the Xylox crystal." Blake nodded, though anxiety gnawed at his gut. Every instinct told him this was a bad idea, storming an alien military base to sabotage their most valuable asset, but they had no choice. If they didn't destroy the gateway, Earth would fall. They moved swiftly but cautiously, Lyria leading the way with a grace that made her seem almost ghost-like in the narrow corridor. Blake followed, his mind racing with 1,000 different thoughts, but one dominated them all: I have to trust her. They reached the central chamber faster than Blake expected, and when they emerged into the massive, domed room, he had to stop and catch his breath. The chamber was enormous, far larger than it had seemed on Lyria's hologram. The ceiling arched high above them, the smooth, metallic walls glowing faintly with the same strange energy that powered the facility. In the center of the room, floating within a network of intricate metal supports, was the Xylox crystal. Blake had never seen anything like it. The crystal was huge, suspended in midair by some kind of energy field, its surface pulsing with a deep, otherworldly light. It looked almost alive, as if it were breathing, its glow waxing and waning with a rhythmic pulse. It was beautiful and terrifying. This crystal was the heart of the gateway, the source of the power that allowed the Xylorians to travel across the stars. And they were here to destroy it. Blake glanced at Lyria, whose face was set in a grim mask of determination. Her eyes were fixed on the crystal, and for a brief moment, Blake saw a flicker of something regret, perhaps, cross her face. But she pushed it aside. "We have to move quickly," Lyria said, her voice low but urgent. "The energy field is strong, but I can destabilize it with this." She held up a small, glowing device that pulsed in sync with the crystal's rhythm. Blake nodded, gripping the pack on his back tightly. "And what do I do?" "Cover me," Lyria said, glancing around the room. "Once I start the process, it will trigger an alarm. We'll have minutes before the entire facility collapses." Blake's throat tightened. Minutes. That's all they had. Lyria stepped forward, moving swiftly toward the crystal. She reached the base of the metal structure that housed it and began working, her fingers deftly manipulating the device she held. Blake's pulse quickened as he watched her, his senses heightened, waiting for the inevitable. Then it happened. A loud, blaring siren erupted from the walls, and the room was suddenly flooded with harsh, red light. Blake's heart leapt into his throat as he spun around, his eyes darting to the corridor they had just come from. "They know we're here," Blake shouted, panic creeping into his voice. Lyria didn't stop working. "I just need a few more seconds." Blake's instincts screamed at him to run, but he stayed rooted in place, scanning the entrance for any sign of approaching Xylorian soldiers. The alarm continued to wail, and the tension in the room became unbearable. Blake's pulse pounded in his ears, drowning out everything else. Then, from the corridor, he heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Heavy, metallic footsteps. Xylorian guards were closing in. "We've got company," Blake shouted, pulling the small, handheld weapon Lyria had given him from his belt. He had barely had time to learn how to use it, but there was no turning back now. Lyria didn't respond. She was too focused on the crystal, her fingers working rapidly over the controls. Blake stood at the ready, his eyes fixed on the entrance as the footsteps grew louder. Then, the guards appeared. They were imposing figures, tall and armored, their faces obscured by sleek helmets that reflected the red emergency lights. Their weapons were drawn, energy rifles aimed at Blake and Lyria. Without thinking, Blake fired, the alien weapon in his hand emitting a bright blue pulse that slammed into the first guard, knocking him back. But more were coming. "How much longer?" Blake yelled, ducking behind a metal column as the guards returned fire, their energy blasts scorching the walls around him. "Almost there." Lyria called back, her voice strained with concentration. Blake fired again, managing to take down another guard, but they kept coming. He could see more of them flooding into the corridor, their numbers overwhelming. His heart pounded in his chest, his hands shaking as he fought to hold them off. And then, with a deafening crack, the crystal's energy field shattered. Blake turned just in time to see the Xylox crystal begin to pulse violently, its glow intensifying to a blinding level. The entire chamber shook, and a low, ominous rumble echoed through the facility. "It's done," Lyria shouted, running toward him. "We have to go now." Blake didn't need to be told twice. He sprinted toward the exit, Lyria close behind, as the room around them began to collapse. The walls buckled, and the floor trembled beneath their feet as the facility's structure started to fail. The guards behind them were scrambling, caught in the chaos as the facility crumbled around them. Blake and Lyria raced through the corridor, dodging falling debris and barely avoiding the collapsing walls as the entire moon's surface began to shake. "How much time do we have?" Blake shouted as they ran, his lungs burning from the effort. "Minutes if we're lucky," Lyria shouted back. They burst through the final door, out onto the barren moon's surface, just as the ground gave way beneath the facility. Blake looked back over his shoulder and saw the massive structure imploding, the gateway collapsing in on itself as the crystal's energy tore it apart. They reached the ship, and Lyria wasted no time, activating its cloaking mechanism as they lifted off the ground. The moon's surface was shaking violently now, cracks spreading across the rocky landscape as the facility was consumed by the destruction. As they shot up into the sky, the gateway collapsed completely, sending a shockwave across the moon's surface. But they were already gone, soaring through space, heading away from Xylora's moon and the chaos they had left behind. Blake slumped back in his seat, his chest heaving with exhaustion, his mind still reeling from the intensity of it all. But as he looked out the window, watching the stars stretch out before them, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. They had done it. The gateway was destroyed. The invasion was stopped. But as he turned to Lyria, who was staring out into space with a distant, unreadable expression, he knew that for her, this wasn't a victory. She had severed the last tie to her people, to her home. And now, she was truly alone. "Are you okay?" Blake asked quietly. Lyria didn't look at him. "I am free," she said softly. "But I have no home to return to." Blake felt a pang of sympathy, but also admiration. She had given up everything to protect Earth, to stop her people from destroying his world. And now, they were both exiles, adrift in the vastness of space. "Earth can be your home," Blake said, his voice gentle. "You saved it, after all." For a long moment, Lyria didn't respond. Then, finally, she turned to him, a small, sad smile on her lips. "Perhaps," she said softly. "Perhaps it can." And as they sailed through the stars, away from the ruins of the gateway and toward an uncertain future, Blake knew that whatever came next, they would face it together.